All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about this concept of social justice. Folks are oftentimes confused by that, or there are so many variations of the definition that I want to use for our discussion this specific definition of social justice. So first of all, what is the law, or what is a law? And a law is a set of principles that are established by a government, that are enforced by a government, that there are fines and taxes and other and consequences for the breaking of these principles that are set up by governments. And so so the law is something that governments set up to help govern the behaviors of their people. And so in a representative democracy, how is it that laws are formed? And so many of us recognize that there are, particularly in the United States, there are three branches of government. There is the legislative branch, there is the judicial branch, and there is the executive branch. And in those branches of government, they each have individual responsibilities. And so in a representative democracy, what we do is we vote people to what we call Congress. And Congress is made up of the House of Representatives and what is also known as the Senate. So even within Congress, there is a division between those two parties that folks have to agree. Now, in a representative democracy, what we do is we vote people into those two houses or those two offices in the United States government to help make laws. And so what they do is the people that they represent, they poll those people, they talk to those people, they ask those people what they want. And oftentimes, some of those people that they're representing get together and create PACs or have lobbyists that work with the voted representatives and say, hey, this is what we want. As a result of that, what typically happens is that since the majority has better representation than the minority, that laws oftentimes in a representative democracy, laws oftentimes get made to benefit the majority without regard to the minority. In terms of representative democracy, all you need is 51% to have something pass. The problem is that means that there is 49% that may disagree with that decision. And that is a large number of individuals to have dissenting on an opinion. And so often when this is in play, this representative democracy is in play, this 51-49 becomes a metaphor for some of the struggles that we encounter when trying to get things done through a legislative process. So the legislative branch creates, in a representative democracy, the legislature creates those laws based on those two houses, and state models oftentimes follow this model, and counties follow this model a bit more differently or more loosely, but this pretty much is how American government works, right? So this representative democracy, 51%, 49%, over 49%. And so what ends up happening oftentimes is that laws are created that benefit the majority to the disincentive of participation of the minority. And so we get this rub. And so then they are created two types of laws, or three types of laws, if you will. So there is the law that is on the books that the representatives have created because the population or the populace, the majority of people say, this is what we want. So those become the laws. But then there are two other subsets of laws that start to be created. And we'll consider for this conversation, we'll talk about unjust laws versus just laws, right? And so an unjust law is one that benefits the 51% without regard to its impact on the 49%. Or unjust laws are laws that benefit from making sure that the 49% don't have access to goods, jobs, services, and money. That would be an unjust law. For example, Jim Crow as a form of government, separate but equal. Don't ask, don't tell. These would be examples of laws that were created by the 51% to the detriment of the 49%, right? So the detriment to the minority. And so oftentimes there are things that we do that are legal, that are unjust, but they are legal. And Dr. King addresses a number of those things, and we'll talk about that when we talk about the letter from the Birmingham jail. I don't want to spill that just yet. But unjust laws keep people from getting access to goods, jobs, services, and money. I'm still talking about what social justice is, right? So this is in the still under social justice. Just laws are those things that actually benefit everyone. And so the unjust laws typically have benefited the majority to the detriment of the minority, where just laws actually benefit everyone. All right? So, and unfortunately, so sometimes what we've tried to do is say that, well, this is just the law, but unfortunately it impacts folks differently, right? So, there was, and I will bring up the statutes associated with this, but for a long time, cocaine was prosecuted in two different ways. Powder cocaine had a lighter sentence because of statute, whereas rock cocaine or crack cocaine held a higher penalty. And so that became those differing in sentencing became unjust laws because they negatively affected the minority than they did the majority, or they gave advantages to the majority at the expense of the minority. And so what we found in the 80s and in the 90s was that there were many more, so there's some social implications of how this law gets enacted that has some real ramifications in our world. And so what we know, or what we found out through looking at history, is that powder cocaine was not typically used in urban or poor areas. It typically was used in higher end communities, if you will, right? So the higher your status, the more likely you were to use powder cocaine, and the lower your status in our society, or the lower your class, the more likely you were to use crack cocaine. Crack cocaine, from what I understand, I'm not an aficionado on these things, but from what I understand, crack cocaine was sold cheaper than powder cocaine, which lended its kind of attractiveness because it was a low-cost drug. It had some different side effects than heroin. So forth and so on. So lots of poor people found themselves either addicted, either as users, as sellers, as a part of the drug trade. And as a society, we said that that's evil and that's bad, and we want to really crack down on crime. And unfortunately, what started to happen with these unjust laws was that it was disproportionately focused on people of color, specifically black people, Hispanic people, and poor people. We also start to see some of that stuff happen again when it comes to glass, or what do they call it on Breaking Bad? So crystal meth, right? So we start to see some of those unjust laws until there is a group of people who are able to kind of rally against these unjust laws to shed light on those unjust laws so that they become just laws. And so sentencing starts to change when we start talking about just laws. We look at, if we even go back to segregation, we start to, we start to understand that segregation is wrong because it does not do what the intent of the law is. And we know that the highest law of the land is the Constitution of the United States. And so if we're not doing things to bolster that document, to hold that document sacred and make sure that people have access to everything that document offers us, then we need to change it. And so those unjust laws need to become just laws. So how does that all fit? What does that have to do with social justice? Well, when we start talking about social justice, what we have to remember is that social justice is the mechanism for actually creating or giving people access to these just laws. Social justice is the process of making sure all people have equal and open access to goods, jobs, services, and money as promised by their government. Is promised by the government. So when we talk about this idea of social justice, people aren't asking for anything more than what their government has promised them. When we talk about the civil rights movement, the strength of it was that folks weren't asking for any special favors. They weren't asking for anything unique or outside of what the Constitution offers them. They just wanted to be guaranteed what was offered to them in the Constitution. And the funny thing is that if we look at the Constitution of the United States, if the 13th and if the 14th Amendments were followed, there would be no need for 1964. 1964 would have never had to happen if people were guaranteed social justice through the mechanisms that were already provided. And so since people weren't able they kept creating these unjust laws. People kept reinforcing unjust laws. To get just laws, people had to protest. People had to picket. People had to fight. The majority system that wanted to say that that they weren't human, they weren't entitled to everything that belonged to them. And so when we talk about this idea of social justice, what we're actually trying to create for folks is the space to operate within what the Constitution of the United States says belongs to all of its citizens. Now, we also understand that there are folks in our communities that may not necessarily be citizens. And so what we've also started, and we said that we're a member of, is something called the United Nations. And the United Nations has something referred to as the Declaration of Human Rights. So when we talk about social justice, we're particularly in the United States, we're talking about civil rights. We're talking about giving people everything that their government says should belong to them. When we start talking about human rights, what we're actually talking about is a global phenomenon that was started with the United Nations and is really driven to making sure that all folks on the planet have access to goods, jobs, services, and money, regardless or without consideration of where they come from ethnically or racially or what their gender is. And so we'll spend some time talking about human rights in just a bit, but I want to stick with this social justice. Because the lack of social justice or the lack of getting the promises of the government actually causes mental health issues. It causes stress. It causes all sorts of health issues, right? And we'll talk about that as well. We'll talk about how poverty it actually is a public health problem, and we'll talk about that. And so when we start talking about social justice, making sure that we identify unjust laws and that we work towards making them just laws so that people have access to the promises that their government has made them. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so when we talk about social justice, those are some of the promises that we're looking to hold our government to, and the systems that are implored or the systems that are governed by our government to make sure that we all have access to those promises. So that is the definition of social justice that we will be using as we continue our conversations.